Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz. First, remind you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, and connecting high school and college students to Israel. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, after all these years, hope you got it. It's jnf.org. And in a short while, well, make sure you have your calendars out because I'll be sharing with you information and dates for Jewish National Fund USA's Conference 2023. You are not going to want to miss it. In the meantime, it's no secret that Israel is chock full of archaeological and heritage sites, and bringing them to life for us on this episode of IsraelCast is Shelley-Anne Peleg. She joins us now via Zoom from her home in Israel. Shelley-Anne, welcome to the program, and tell us where exactly you're zooming in from.
Hi, thank you for having me on the show today. It's my pleasure. I'm actually joining you from my office at home, which is in Yokneam, about 20 minutes southeast of Haifa. That's where I am sitting now at the moment.
All right. Well, listen, thanks again for joining us. And we should share with our listeners, your name is Shelley-Anne, but before we started rolling, you said that you also go by Shelley. So for ease of conversation, I'm just going to call you Shelley during our chat today. How's that?
Very well.
All right, listen. And I think also our listeners will detect that you are not a Sabra. You were not born in Israel. You're originally from South Africa. So before we talk about archaeology in Israel and some of the work that you're doing in the places you love to show visitors, share with us how a girl from South Africa ends up becoming an archaeologist in Israel.
We immigrated to Israel. We came on Aliyah after the Yom Kippur War, and I was a child then. And I remember, when we came to Israel, we lived on a absorption center very, very close to Jerusalem. And I remember in the first or the second week after we came to Israel, my parents took us to Masada, which is perhaps one of the most famous archaeological sites in Israel. And I remember wandering around there and looking at these ruins, and I was a kid, right? A young kid then. And I remember walking around these ruins, and somehow my dad had fallen in love with the ancient story of Israel. He, by the way, had this notion of coming to Israel to become a shepherd. And we were roaming around these ruins, and he was telling me a little bit about the story of Masada, and telling me mostly about Yigael Yadin, perhaps one of the most famous archaeologists of that time. And I then and there told my parents that I wanted to be like him, like Yigael Yadin. Well, you know, I thought it was kind of a crazy, childish notion. And when I completed my army service, and I was actually in the United States then, I asked my parents to please enroll me at the Hebrew University in the Department of Archaeology. And here I am, so many years later, with a PhD, not in archaeology, by the way. Let me specify what I actually do. But for the last 32 years or 33 years, this archaeology, conservation, preservation has become my life.
Yeah, and share with our listeners what your PhD is in it.
Okay, so I used to work for I worked for the Israel Antiquities Authority for many years, for 25 years actually. And for the majority of this period, I was based in this amazing historical city in North Israel called Akko. And I became the director of the conservation center there. I was involved very much with training the conservation people there. And I was much involved with all the ongoing projects of Akko. And during this period, I decided to kind of make a little turn in my career. And my PhD was actually in conservation of Akko and other historical cities in Israel as well.
From University of Haifa, as I
University
understand.
of Haifa, yes, where I'm a lecturer today.
Mm-hmm.
I lecture in the University of Haifa in the Israel Studies department. I'm also a lecturer at the Kinneret College. Yeah.
Right. And you're also chair of the Israel Intangible Heritage Committee.
Right. Of ICOMOS, which is an international organization of volunteers, by the way. And we all volunteer for different aspects of conservation issues of built heritage. And I initiated this idea that built heritage can never live without the living heritage. So I established this committee, and I'm the chair of this committee and the general secretary of the International Intangible Committee of ICOMOS as well.
So what are the biggest challenges then, Shelley, when it comes to heritage preservation?
Okay, so I would say that first of all, let's talk about the amount of sites that we have in Israel.
Sure.
We have listed archaeological sites are about 35,000 sites in the entire country, and there must be a couple of thousands of more sites that haven't yet been listed or excavated. I would say roughly we're talking about 40,000 archaeological sites in Israel. Now, what we say is that according to the antiquities law in Israel, an archaeological site is anything that was used or built by human beings up till the year 1700. So having Israel as such a densely archaeological country is a huge challenge for us. What do we do with all of these sites? How do we excavate them? What happens after we excavate them to these sites? How do we ensure that their life continues? So that's one issue. Another huge big issue, Israel as a very, very small country and an ongoing developing country, we also very often find ourselves during construction procedures of roads, of buildings, of structures, we find ourselves on top, above, around archaeological sites. So then what do we do? How do we address this issue of ongoing development programs, which are very, very strongly needed on the one hand, and on the other hand, of this amazing heritage that we might have to and do have to many times we have to forfeit. Instead of the archaeological sites, we build a road.
Are there laws in terms of archaeological preservation? And then talk about that life cycle then. So if, for example, someone wants to build a building and they discover that there was I'm making this up, a cemetery there from the year 300, then what happens?
Okay, so there are areas in Israel that in order to get a building permit, you have to first you have to get a permission for the construction or the development. You have to get permission from the Israel Antiquities Authority. Like, you get a building permission to build, but before you even plan your structure, you need that permission from the Israel Antiquities Authority in certain areas. Now, you get the permission, and an inspector will come and make sure you're not harming the archaeological sites. And if you do, the construction or the development procedure will be stopped, and you would have to hold an excavation, a salvage excavation, after which, depending on the type of findings, the site will be released. After we rescue all the data and the information, the site will be given back to the owner of the land to continue the construction. So often, in such big development procedures, we're going to be forfeiting archaeological sites. This is in the case of a salvage excavation. If, like, for instance, a couple of years back in the 90s, when they uncovered this amazing Byzantine, late Roman, early Byzantine mosaic of this amazing villa in the city of Lod, the site was not released back to the owner. It was covered up, and when money came in for the conservation procedure of the mosaic, the mosaic was restored, preserved, and a museum was built around the mosaic. But that's like a very, very unique story.
Are there some archaeological sites or some pieces like this mosaic, for example, that are just so important that the government will say, absolutely, positively, you cannot build? Yet, are there other sites that are really insignificant? And then the government says, you know what, this isn't so important. There are some remains here, but it's not really historically relevant. So, you know, geh gesundheit, go start building.
Yes, we have both of these options are both relevant. They're both optional, and sometimes in like not so far from my house, they found during the construction of the streets just around the corner of my house, they found this archaeological site, which they didn't have. They didn't have funding to hold a salvage excavation, because, by the way, a salvage excavation is funded by the owner of the land or by the entrepreneur, which is pretty tough in some issues. So there wasn't enough funding to hold the salvage excavation. So what the government or the Israel Antiquities then did was instruct the city of Yokneam, in which I live, to cover up the site, and they changed the way the road went around the site instead of through it. And instead of what they had intended to build there, we have a beautiful park now, which has just been covered with lawn, and it's a beautiful park. But underneath it, and most people don't even know that underneath it, hidden there, is this amazing archaeological site that is waiting for someday for someone to maybe show interest in.
Shelley, so that's where I wanted to go with you right now, because as I mentioned before we started rolling here, I'm a huge archaeological buff. I love traveling to the Near East, the Middle East, and visiting these wonderful sites. I remember I was in Iran in 2007, and I remember the moment I was in Susa, or Shushan, and I was taken to the archaeological site there. And I remember seeing a ruin here, something small there. I remember seeing sort of it looked like a lion guardian. It could have been the guardian of a gate, for example. It was not a very robust archaeological site, but you could see a few things. And at that moment, I thought to myself, I cannot imagine what is below ground here. And then I started thinking, I cannot imagine what is below ground from Iran all the way through North Africa and beyond. I mean, even here in the Americas, for example. So I'm wondering, in the Israeli context, what are you particularly excited about that one day will be unearthed? And really, how much is below ground?
Oh, wow. Well, even on a regular academic excavation of a site, you can never, ever excavate a full site. It's impossible. I mean, way back, let's say 100 years ago, the first archaeologists in the Holy Land, which, by the way, many of them were Americans, had this idea that they would be able to kind of peel off layer by layer by layer sites. And slowly but surely, they understood that it would be impossible. Like in sites that are that are layered so strongly, it's impossible to peel off all of the layers. So what we actually do in an excavation is we kind of choose different points of the sites, and those are the sites that are excavated, so we can get an idea how big the site was. On an academic site, I'm talking, not about a salvage and excavation, on an ongoing, once a year academic site that, you know, professors will come from perhaps all over the year, back and back and back again to the same site to continue to excavate for academic objectives.
Right.
Yeah. So even then, they would only choose like different points of the site that would give them a larger idea. So I mean, anywhere that we touch, the biggest sites in Israel have never ever been fully excavated. I can talk to you about a city, a Roman city not far from where I live in Beit She'an, which is the most amazing Roman Byzantine site. These amazing stones and streets and monuments that we can walk through, that we only have the center of the city. So we have these amazing monuments, these amazing pillars, this amazing theater, these amazing fountains throughout the city, huge. But we have almost no idea about everyday life. Where did the people live? What did they eat? What did they go? Where did they work? What did their homes look like? And I mean, this is something that I think is becoming more and more, if we can say in this way, fashionable in archaeology today, to try and understand more and more, not about the huge monuments, but more and more about just regular everyday sites and places where people lived. Does this give you an answer?
It does definitely give me an answer, but is there a site in particular? Like, is that the site that you say, I really want that whole site to be excavated? Or is there one in particular in Israel that you say, wow, we really need to get going on this one? And also related to that, Shelley, is it money? Is that really what's holding up a lot of this?
Okay, so it's always about money.
Hmm.
It's always about money, and it's also about preservation. Because on the contrary, I would say if there's not enough funding that includes preservation of whatever has been uncovered, rather do not excavate. Whatever is kept underground will continue to live, and it will still be there, perhaps for future generations. And if there's not money for preservation and not enough funding for publication, not general publication for the public, but I'm talking about scientific publications, rather stop the excavations and concentrate on keeping whatever's been uncovered. So I would say even these huge big sites that we're still lacking so much information about, and I would be really interested to see what's going on. I would say rather let's make sure that we have that the site can continue, that could still live after we finish the excavations. More than often, what happens on a site which doesn't have a fence around and a gate, or a place that we buy a ticket for, these 35,000 out of the 35,000 that I just mentioned, most of them are just outside, and they've been excavated and they're just standing there. So instead of them being continuing their life, they're actually deteriorating and pieces are falling down, and rather stop there. So there's, yes, I'm interested in knowing more, but with what we have, I think we also have a lot, and we need to kind of balance this
I'm
somehow.
so I'm so glad you brought that up, Shelley, because I hadn't considered that. That yes, indeed, it's important to unearth everything. But then what happens? Then you need the preservation. And if you can't preserve it, there's that whole argument behind the Elgin marbles, for example, that the British took them. And I think probably I'm glad that they did, because they could have been destroyed otherwise. Now it's a whole question, do they give them back to Greece? So that's a very interesting point that you raised, and one that I think that we should all consider as we move forward. And I hadn't considered that. So I appreciate that. So for the layman that goes to an archaeological site, let's say in Israel, because that's what we're called, IsraelCast. It's not called any other cast, any other kind. It's not called South Africa cast here. So for anyone that's going to Israel, for example, how would you say that the layman should approach visiting an archaeological site to better understand it? And related to that, Shelley, how do you bring the site to life? And at this point, let me just give a shout out to your website, which is shelleyculturalheritage.com. And that's SHELLEY culturalheritage.com, because you do offer wonderful tours to archaeological and heritage sites. And so we want our dear listeners around the world that are coming to Israel to definitely get in touch with you to have you bring them to life. So how do you bring them to life? And by the same token, whether someone goes with you or not, how should they approach visiting an archaeological site versus a heritage site per se, which probably is a very different dynamic there?
Okay, well, let's just mention shortly something about heritage sites. Any site in Israel that's 1700 and upwards is designated as a historical heritage site and usually easier to visit and easier to understand.
Right.
So we'll put that aside and talk about archaeology.
By the way, can I just ask you a question? Why is that cutting off point 1700, the year 1700? Anything before, as you said, is considered an archaeological, and anything after is a heritage site? Because in my mind, that seems rather late.
It is, it is. So this is inheritance that we received from the British Mandate. The Antiquity Department of the British Mandate had designated 1700. We understand that anything that's designated as an archaeological site means that there's a very, very strong antiquity law that actually is there to save the site, which means a lot of funding is needed. There was an idea a couple of years back of like reinstating the antiquity law in Israel and perhaps bringing the date up to 1800. But once we open the law, it will also mean opening other issues of this law, including funding issues. So 1700 is the date, and it will stay that way. The British then had thought, they had made this calculation of how many generations back, and they came to this idea of 1700, which is just an inheritance that we received from them.
Yeah, I was going to say the British have been out of there for an awfully long time. It's 75 years.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, the antiquity law was only reinstated in 78, which is also quite a long time after the British left here. So yeah, so for
Indeed.
many years we're actually using the initial British antiquity law. Yeah.
Right. Well, I interrupted that whole
Sorry.
line of questioning. So how should someone approach visiting an archaeological site, and then how do you bring these sites to life?
Okay, I think it makes a big difference which kind of a site you're visiting. If we talk about the very early prehistoric biblical sites, that's really tough because the remains themselves, although the stories are very, very strong, the remains themselves are usually kind of, small, you need a lot of imagination to understand what's going there on the one hand. But on the other hand, if we're talking about these biblical sites and the biblical story, like Tel Megiddo, not so far from where I live as well, the site here, Armageddon, which might be more known to the listeners, this site is of huge importance from all biblical times, a Canaanite city, an Israelite city, connected to King Solomon, very, very strong and important sites, historically, biblical talking, but the site in itself there, the remains are so kind of, small, barely seen there. So I would say, in order to understand a site like this, the best way is to find a good guide or to read a little bit about the site itself. So I think that's we can start there for these earlier sites. If we're talking about Roman sites and onwards, well, the better preserved or the better developed sites are standing there. And if you walk along a street in a Roman or Byzantine time, you actually see, feel, and understand the street as you walk along it. Mm-hmm. And I think there it's also always a good idea to have a good guide. It's always a good idea. But even without a good guide, if you have like good imagination, and if you strongly connect to the ideas of the Roman technologies, Roman life, Byzantine, which means in Israel, it means Christianity, early Christianity. I mean, that's much easier just to kind of read a little bit and use a lot of your imagination. to understand what life was like then.
And Shelley, tell me if I'm crazy or not, but I very much believe that energy is absorbed into objects, absorbed into buildings, into stones. And I mean, do you ever walk into someone's house and you feel either this great energy or you feel like there's really bad energy, like it's coming from the people? And so when I've been to archaeological sites or I've been to other historical sites, heritage sites, if you will, throughout the world, even genocide sites, I have had visceral experiences in these locations. Am I crazy?
I don't think you are crazy. I don't think you're crazy at all. I often get this feeling. I was just this morning on an excavation. I went to see one of my colleagues' excavations. And when I walked along this little village, small little tiny Roman village from 200, from the second century AC, and I walked along there, and he was showing me these stones that were obviously stones of a small little shul, synagogue, that's situated there. I mean, I take one look at these stones and I feel to myself, well, this one, and I get shivers as I say this, but these stones were part of a place that was like kind of holy and important to the small community, 300 people that had lived in the small little town or village um, almost 2,000 years ago. And this place was so important to them. There was a mikveh around the corner. And, and I can actually feel what people might have felt when they walked into this place that all we have there are the remnants of the synagogue, but I can actually feel how it might have touched their heart to walk into such a place, and it touches my heart as well.
Some places I just feel have ghosts.
Yes,
Have you ever felt
yes,
that?
yes, and I think that the ghosts are often the small finds that you pull out of there that
Hmm.
tell us the story of who these people were. So it can be, like we saw today, we saw some of the oil lamps. The remnant, this little town that I visited this morning was a small little village in which the people that lived there were specialists in making oil lamps. This is what they did. So there were 300 people, more or less, that lived in the small little town, and there they made thousands and thousands and thousands of oil lamps. And people from all over Israel or all over the Jewish Galilee then were buying these oil lamps from these people. And we pull out these small little remnants of the oil lamps that were actually found broken, meaning that these were not the good ones that were sold, but these were the pieces that that didn't come out nicely, so they were thrown away. And we're pulling out a little piece here and a little bit piece there. And these are the ghosts. These are the people. These are the hands of those people that actually touched these remnants. And this is the connection I feel. We talked earlier on about the monuments, and I said, I prefer these small little remnants that are stuff that people threw away because they weren't good enough to be sold on the market, or perhaps like you walk and you find a footprint of someone who had walked in while laying a mosaic. They walked on the wet mortar, and they left this like this their footmark, and that is the ghost. That is when I get this feeling that I'm actually connecting, touching, feeling an actual person, just like me, just a regular person, not like this big emperor or a soldier, just a simple person like me. These are the ghosts that I am so much interested in.
All right. Listen, before we take a break, I do want to ask you something as it relates to those that deny the fact that Israel is the ancestral home of the Jewish people. And when you look at the archaeology, I mean, it obviously is clear that that is the ancestral home of the Jewish people. And I'm just wondering, how do you respond to all these people? I mean, are they
Well,
just so blind, or what's your take?
well, What can I tell you? I would say that perhaps they're blind. And how can you argue when the historical resources and the archaeological remnants connect to each other and tell the same story? It connects so well to each other, even if, and we do have a lot of arguments about especially about the biblical sites. Is the dating right? Does it really connect to King Solomon? Does it really connect to King David? Were these people really exist? But in actual fact, when you connect some of the later biblical resources to the actual finds and when they connect to each other, how can you argue against this? It's there. It is just there.
All right. I think well said. I have nothing to add to that, Shelley-Anne. Well, listen, I just want to take a really, really quick pause before we start talking about Akko, which is your area of expertise. And I just want to share with our listeners that, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Shelley-Anne, I don't know what you're doing from November 30th to December 3rd, but that's when Jewish National Fund USA's conference on Israel is going to be taking place. It's going to be in Denver, Colorado. Again, it's called Jewish National Fund USA Global Conference from Israel. It's the place to be, taking place in Denver. It is just a wonderful, interactive experience over a couple of days. There's going to be outstanding speakers, as always. There's just this great ruach, this great spirit, networking opportunities, and you get to hear from people that are really reshaping the future of the Jewish state. Plus, if you like food, we haven't talked about food and archaeology. We'll have to have you back on to talk about that because I don't know if we have enough time in this session, but there will be America's largest Shabbat dinner there as well. And for all of you, dear listeners, that enjoy IsraelCast, yours truly will be doing 2 sessions, 2 live recordings of IsraelCast at the national conference, again, November 30th to December 3rd. I believe one of the recordings is on November 30th. I have to check my calendar for that, but would love to see each and every one of you there. So do join me and all these other wonderful people at the conference. Visit jnf.org/global. Once again, jnf.org/global, November 30th to December 3rd. And we hope to see you there. I don't know if you're able to join us, Shelley, or not. I don't know if there's much archaeology actually in Denver, Colorado. I'm going to have to investigate that, but they might have some kind of archaeological museum there, and I'll report back to you, Shelley, on that one. Yes, but in the meantime, I want to continue our conversation right now and talk about Akko, because you specialize in Akko. You mentioned that at the top of the show. You've been working in the city for the last 25 years, quarter century or more, actually. You were sent there, but clearly your work has continued there. So what has been the enduring allure for you of Akko, and what continues to keep it going for you?
Okay, so the city of Akko, I don't know, like, we were talking earlier on about ghosts and spirits. So somehow the city called me there. And I found myself, I was like appointed there a job. And I joined the Israel Antiquities in Akko when the excavations had just begun. So I think Akko is a very, very special story in Israel. We have the biblical and ancient sites, which is situated kind of in the east part of the city on a mound, on what we call a tell, and is being excavated since the 70s and up till just before COVID time. So that's the earlier area of Akko, but I think I was especially intrigued by the historical city. In the 13th century, the Akko became the capital city of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusaders, by the way. This became, in the second period that the Crusaders ruled the Holy Land, they didn't manage to recapture Jerusalem, which earlier on had been their main capital. But in the second period of the Crusaders, the second 100 years of the Crusaders here in the Holy Land, the city of Akko became their capital. It was the king that lived there himself. The different knight orders lived in Akko, and different sea merchants from all over Europe were all centered in Akko. And the city was really, really strongly built up, and really, really, when I talk strongly built, I'm talking about structures that still stand on ground today. And this city was destroyed by the Mamluks at the end of the 13th century in 1291. And when the Mamluks that had come to the Holy Land from Egypt, when they destroyed Akko, they destroyed only the upper parts of the buildings that were standing there. What they had wanted was to prevent the Crusaders coming back on another crusade to the Holy Land, and it worked. It was enough for them just to destroy the upper parts of the structures. And the city, once the capital, this very strong capital city of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, was left hundreds of years deserted, and the structures were still standing there. And in the 18th century, when the ruler of the land then, a Bedouin sheikh, decided to rebuild a capital on the shoreline of the country, what he did was he came back to the city that was still standing there and rebuilt one building exactly intact over the Crusader structures that were standing there till 1291.
That had been ruined.
That had been ruined. That was still standing there, but they were in ruins. So all he did was rebuilt the structures that were still standing there. And it is in these buildings that the current population that live in the historical center of Akko live today. So basically what we have here is a three-layered city, one being the current modern city, living city of Akko. These people live in the Ottoman, in the 18th century structures that were built intact above the Crusader city. So, I mean, this is like so interesting when you walk along an alley of a living city, that you're actually walking along the urban layout of that city that was destroyed at the end of the 13th century, which is so interesting. And in places like, or you have to you excavate just a little bit underneath the streets of today, and there you are, standing in these huge, amazing structures, huge, endless walls, strong, thick. They're still standing there. And we were talking about what do you need to understand what an archaeological site is. It's just so easy in Akko just to see it all coming together in one place. I think this is so interesting how the current people that live there today live within the ruins from the end of the 13th century.
And before we do a little bit more of a deep dive into Akko and the region, I'm being really presumptuous that all of our listeners around the world know exactly where Akko is. I think many of them do, but we have a very international audience. So for anyone that has not been to Israel, is new to IsraelCast, is new to the city of Akko, just describe exactly where it is.
Okay, so Akko is situated on the shoreline of north of Israel. It's about 20 kilometers. I don't know what that means in miles, but it's about 20 kilometers or half an hour away from the big city of Haifa.
12 miles, yeah.
How much?
I think it's about 12 miles.
Okay, all right. I take your word for this. And it's actually...
I'm not too good at math. That's why I'm a podcaster, but I think it's 12 miles.
That's why I'm an archaeologist.
That's right. It's very close, but at least you know the dates of things. You got that right.
Yeah, it's easy. Yeah. But anyway, so Haifa is situated like on the bay, on the southern part of this big bay. And on the northern part of this big bay is the city of Akko. So, I mean, this is like a natural protected entrance into the Holy Land, which is in the north part of the Holy Land, which is why the city thrived there for thousands and thousands of years. Because as I mentioned to you before, the earlier periods are there, but not in the same place as the Crusader sites.
And so you take people to hidden Akko and hidden treasures surrounding Akko. What are some of your favorite places, and where should people really do a deep dive into?
Okay, so I take any archaeological site that I do visit, which is in the north, but not only, I do Caesarea, I do Beit She'an as well. I do archaeological sites in Sipori, which is also very much well known to a lot of people. I think, especially for people that have been to Israel before or are interested in backstage or off the beaten track kind of archaeology, you. So I'm waiting
That's
for
me,
you.
yes.
Yes, I'm waiting for you. We would find ourselves in our discussions also kind of understanding some of the dilemmas and the challenges, and which even if we visit like the simple sites, just to understand the dilemmas are important. In the Western Galilee, we have this amazing site, which I was just at yesterday, called Yodfat, which is situated in the Western Galilee. A very important site from the big revolt of the Jewish people in the year 67. That was where the big Jewish revolt against the Romans actually began. So that's also a site, an amazing site with an amazing story, which actually tells us a story of how this very, very small Jewish community rose up to fight these 2,000 people that were living in the small little village hidden away in the mountains, rose up to fight against 20,000 Roman soldiers. They didn't succeed, but it began there. This big revolt that ended in Masada began there in the north, in North Israel, in Yodfat. So that would be like a very, very interesting site to visit. And obviously so many other hidden crusader sites, crusader fortresses, Byzantine, Christian churches. We talk about the diversity of Israel. The Western Galilee definitely gives the diversity of the different cultures from ancient times.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the diversity of the people of Akko. Can you just touch on that for a moment, Shelley?
Definitely, definitely. So I'm going to talk very openly here and say that the city of Akko is a city. It's a multicultural city. We actually talk about a mixed city of Jewish and Arabs that live together. And I know this might be difficult for some people to understand, but this is a unique situation in Israel. Usually you would find, like where I live, that's how it was developed. Usually you would find Jewish cities or Arab villages. That's the usual situation in Israel. That's because of language. It's because of different religious rituals, and that's just how the situation is in Israel. Fortunately or unfortunately, that's what it is. And Akko is, I think, one of the other magical issues about the city is the fact that it's a multicultural city of Jewish and Arab people that live there together. So about a third of the population there are Arabs. It's a town of about 56,000 people, which is a kind of a middle-sized city in Israel. A third are Arabs. Out of these Arabs, the majority are Muslims. Many of them are religious Muslims. You can tell by the amount of mosques in the city. The Jewish community is also a very, very mixed population. Initially, after Israel was established, the immigrants that were brought to live in Akko were either from Morocco or from East Europe. They were coming from Romania. So even that, like a mixed cultural different Jewish communities, they all live together in Akko, and sometimes in one building, in one apartment building, you'll find neighbors of either cultures. I think this is an amazing example of how things could actually work together.
A lot of good food, I'm sure, in that building,
Yes, for sure. For
right?
sure.
A lot
For
of
sure.
fusion cuisine going on there.
Yes.
So I just have to tell you, as an aside, before we talk about what's going on with the Western Galilee Now group, which is just phenomenal in my book, for years, Shelley, I've been saying I want to buy an old Ottoman house there and renovate it and kind of just set up shop there. And I think the train has left the station on that one, but tell me if I'm wrong. Are there any to be had right now?
Well, they are, but unfortunately, even during COVID, I said to my husband, let's buy an Ottoman structure in Akko. I want to renovate it, etc., etc. The train is left. I mean, I cannot afford it anymore. There's also another issue once you buy one of these homes. The preservation issues are so expensive. You need to update a home that was built 100, 200, 300 years ago, bring in proper electricity, running water, etc., etc. It's like even the mortar that has to be reinstalled or whatever. The train is definitely left for me. So I don't know about you, but for me, yes.
It is I think it's left for me also. I can only sort of renovate my dreams. That city is so incredibly charming, and it kind of brings up the whole conversation of what's going on in the Western Galilee, now. And Jewish National Fund USA, as you know, is behind the Akko Visitor Center, which has been such a catalyst for so many visiting the region, because there's a tendency for people to, let's say, go to Haifa, go to the Baha'i Gardens and Temple, which is amazing, spend an hour in Akko, and then they move on to the Kinneret and then call it a day. I want you to talk about really the real beauty of what's going on in the Western Galilee at this moment, the whole Western Galilee Now movement. We've had Michal here on the program. In fact, when we stayed at the Western Galilee it was February 2019, I have to remember my dates there. And I was just bowled over by everything that's going on up there right now. The artisans, the food, the winemakers, the chefs, the bread makers, and people like you. And so talk about that whole movement and the importance of joining a network like that helps to create a real community and helps to really get the message out that visitors to Israel should really spend a good couple of days. You can spend a whole week or 2 weeks just in the Western Galilee, but people really should spend enough time there because there's plenty to do. And a lot of it is just really, really hidden at this point.
Right. Well, first of all, I must say that the Western Galilee Now and the JNF have really been a big, how do you say this properly in English?
Like a catalyst,
yeah.
yeah.
Yes, definitely for the development of small boutique businesses, tourist industries in Israel. And when I left the Israel Antiquities Authority about 6 or 7 years ago, I remember I knew Michal and all her staff, and I kept saying, I need to join the Western Galilee Now, and I didn't really know what I meant. And they kept telling me, well, speak to Rinat, speak to Rinat, speak to Rinat. And I never ever phoned Rinat. One day, Rinat called me and she offered me to join Western Galilee Now. I was just kind of finding my way as a tourist entrepreneur, as well as being involved in archaeology. And I went and met her and heard about what was going on with this movement. And I filled out all the forms, etc., etc. And 2 weeks after COVID broke out, Rinat from Western Galilee Now called me to say, we've accepted you into Western Galilee Now. This is 2 weeks after COVID. We were sitting at home,
Great timing.
Yes, great timing. It was an amazing call, and for me, this was like mind-blowing that we could actually, during COVID, as a tourist entrepreneur, I could benefit already from what was going on through the Western Galilee Now organization. And since then, I myself, I'm so well educated on the Western Galilee, I have found myself, found so many interesting and less known things to do in the Western Galilee. Like, we join forces, we keep joining forces together to build a better product. So, for instance, yesterday, given a very specialized archaeological tour of some of the sites that I mentioned to you before, I cooperated with 3 different entrepreneurs that have nothing to do with archaeology, but created not just an archaeological visit to sites, but a much bigger experience. So we visited one of the theaters, and we visited the dance company, and we visited one of the wineries. And this creates like such a rich experience for people. Actually, when I began to build this yesterday day, I found, I thought to myself, well, I could create 3, 4, 5 days of these specialized experiences that are really very boutiquey and unusual, that give, a much bigger idea of how people actually live here.
So what you're saying is that the Western Galilee now group has really created synergy. I know that word synergy is sometimes overused, but I think it's relevant here, right? In terms of
Definitely.
cooperation, one person's offering and another person's offering coming together and then offering it for really the benefit of not only Israelis that might want to go up there, but certainly for those of us outside of Israel that want to visit Israel and explore. Because getting back to Akko just for a second, there is that visitor center, which is fantastic. Right, the Akko Visitor Center, beautiful.
Amazing.
But also you can stay in Akko. There are these like boutique hotel kind of situations, aren't there?
Right.
It's so
So
charming, really.
they're charming, and recently quite a few of them have actually joined the Western Galilee Now organization. So that's like, I work with them. So we would also create this kind of experience of living there in one of these charming little boutique, more bed and breakfasty place, and then a specialized tour and a visit to some of these galleries. And this is in Akko, but throughout the Western Galilee, there are some of these additional kind of very, very special experience, boutique places to stay as well. So you can like spend your entire visit just in the Western Galilee, and each day will be completely new, and all of these different things coming together create this amazing experience, I think.
So Shelley-Anne, we stayed in a place called Cleel. You know Cleel?
Yes, yes,
I've
definitely.
I want to tell you, I fell in love with that place.
Yeah,
And
well,
I thought to myself, I would just love to come here. And we were in a house. There were four of us, and two of us were in one house, and there were two other people in another house. There were just like a couple of houses there. And then we had Hagit, who was doing all the cooking for us, and she was just a phenomenal hostess for us and a great chef. Everything was super fresh, really delicious. Being plant-based, she just went above and beyond in terms of what she provided me with. And I thought, and the view was just magnificent. It was over these sort of mountains and rolling hills. And I thought to myself, I should just come and just hang out here and just sit on the balcony and work on my writing and work on my sort of photography in terms of culling through thousands and thousands of photos and just my creative pursuits. And then you go to the winery and you go to as I said, the bread maker, you go to the fragrance maker, you go to all these different places. And it's a charming, charming experience. It really is. And it was just, I felt like my blood pressure just totally returned back to normal.
yeah, yeah. Instead of running around all over the country, you specialize in one beautiful area with all these amazing experiences. And I
Right.
think you get a really wide variety of options that all
Every
come together.
Everyone was so chilled out also,
Yeah, yeah,
you know.
yeah.
And so, because I love Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, of course, there's only one Jerusalem in the world.
Right.
However, to live, there's such an allure and it's so appealing to live in a place like where you are or away from the center, right? And if you can just, as we wind down our conversation, just talk about that.
Well, the Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are always there, and we can always go there, go back there. But I think this is the special feeling of just being in one place and kind of putting everything together. And this is how we live. So we live in a beautiful place as well. And yes, I enjoy going to Tel Aviv, but I do enjoy coming home to a more kind of a quiet area, with, I don't know, something more, perhaps we could say even idealistic, more spiritual, maybe something that gives like something that fills up my insides much more. I would say that is a spiritual feeling.
Well, Shelley, before we wrap, Jewish National Fund USA believes it's very important to reclaim the whole narrative of what Zionism is all about. And so from that perspective, I'd love to hear what Zionism means to you and what you're most proud of when it comes to being a Zionist.
Okay, first of all, I'm definitely very strongly identified with the country that I live in, although I'm South African born, although I have family all over the world. This is the place for me. This is my culture. I think that some of the very, very touching days are when we walk around here on Friday, and even to people that I don't know who they are, and I say Shabbat Shalom to, I think this is a strong feeling of what it means to live here, or Yom Kippur when the country comes to a complete standstill. My Zionism is being here and being part of something that is here and being able to bring in people from other places all over the world, Jewish people, non-Jewish people, and showing this amazing multicultural country in which people live together, in which people welcome other Jewish people from all over the world, and we're always here for everyone. And I mean, I can connect to anyone. I'll never forget one year I was in, like, when I was very, very young, I was in New York on Yom Kippur, and I'll never forget, and I knew no one there. And I'll never forget that evening of Yom Kippur. I dressed nicely and I walked outside and walked and followed everyone to the shul. And I sat there in the shul and I knew exactly what was going on. And I think this is this amazing feeling, connection between the Jewish community from all over the world. And this is when people come to visit me here from all over the world, from the partnership, from wherever they're coming, from the JNF. I think this feeling that we connect, although we don't know each other, this is what Zionism is for me, this amazing connection.
Absolutely beautiful. Shelley, aka Shelley-Anne Peleg, we want to thank you so much, truly, for inspiring us here on this episode of IsraelCast. I, for one, after this conversation, can't wait to make it to Akko in the West and the rest of the Western Galilee, because, like I said, I wasn't there. I hadn't been there since 2019, and I'm well overdue for a visit. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you back for more.
Thank you very much for having me. Look forward.
And by the way, we got through this conversation without your cat screaming for food.
Yeah, he'll come along now.
All right, very good. Hey, by the way, before we really wrap, I do have a question, if I can beg your indulgence, just for another moment or so. So you're a big cat person. I love cats. I love dogs. Can you talk about cats and dogs in antiquity? I mean, were people keeping them then? They must have, especially cats, I'd imagine, to keep out
Well,
the rats.
um, well, I can tell you that in Egypt, cats were like a sacred animal.
Right, right.
Yeah, in Egypt. Cats and dogs. I'm trying to think. Yes, I do know of one prehistorical site that, alongside the skeleton that was found there, that was buried, they also found a skeleton of a dog. So they obviously did have a dog, these people, that was buried with the owner.
You're talking about in
Um,
Israel.
in Israel, yes. This is in one of the caves on the Carmel Mountains. Yeah.
Oh, right. Very good. Well, lots to unearth still. So I'm sure we're going to find more animals down there with their pet parents. But in the meantime, once again, Shelley, we want to thank you so much for joining us on this episode of IsraelCast. I know I threw that curveball at you, but of course you were up to the task to answer it. And we'll indeed have info about Shelley, also known, as I said, as Shelley, on the show notes page of this very episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And of course, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. Simply search for IsraelCast. It's so easy. And don't forget to rate and review us, because that really helps us with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more folks around the world to find us. Those are just the rules in podcast land. I don't make up those rules. Or you can always enjoy the show by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. And it takes a whole moshav and a whole archaeological team to put IsraelCast together. And for that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Dara Shapiro, JD Krebs, and Ellie Kadrin. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios, right here in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. And for more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, I know Shelley would love to hear from you, and so would I. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.